Phaedo is one of the most famous of Plato's dialogues because it allows us to take a look into the mind of Socrates on the day of his death. As you may have learned from my previous works on Plato's dialogues, Socrates was facing the death penalty for impiety and corrupting the youth. Interestingly, this dialogue was written before the Republic and discusses his theory of forms that we later see in the aforementioned text. This dialogue is focused on the idea of death and our soul. The question is, are our souls immortal, and what happens to them when we die? Socrates too ponders these age-old questions. We begin with a conversation between Echecrates and Phaedo, the latter of whom was witness to Socrates' death. Echecrates begs Phaedo to tell him every detail of that day. He says that on the day that Socrates is to be killed, Phaedo and a group of friends go to visit the philosopher in his prison cell, where they find him and his wife and child. After Socrates' family leaves, the conversation turns to death. Is it okay for a philosopher to commit suicide? Socrates believes that it is not, because that would anger our creators, or creator. But his friends quickly point out that he seemingly contradicts his idea that philosophers should be willing to die for what they believe is right. This sets up a broader discussion that we will now get into. Socrates believes that death is when the soul finally is freed from the body. He believes that it is especially true for a philosopher because he seeks no bodily pleasures, and that our senses can be deceptive so that the soul is what really finds truth. In other words, the soul is a pathway to the forms, which are the perfect versions of everything that is. Philosophy is the furthest we can get from the body and the closest to the soul while living. Since Socrates is a philosopher and thus desires to be closer to the forms and his soul, then he ought not fear death. The conversation then moves to the immortality of the soul. Socrates begins by making an argument that all things have opposites, such as night and day, dead and alive, and all things must find equilibrium. Therefore, if the dead in the underworld come from the living, then the living must also come from those that have died. Not perhaps the strongest argument, but we will move to the second argument now. The second argument is sort of an argument from déjà vu. Essentially, in order to come up with a picture in your head of your lover, when you see something that belongs to them, you must have prior knowledge of your lover. The same is true when we get déjà vu, or something comes to us that we did not know that we knew. This knowledge must have come to us from before we were born. Lastly, he argues that when we die, our soul leaves our body and heads to the world of the forms, which is eternal, unchanging, and perfect. Simmias has a few problems with Socrates' argument, the main objection being that though harmony and an instrument are connected like the soul and the body, if you break the instrument, then the harmony is gone. And also, that maybe the soul exists before birth, but eventually it will be worn out like an old shirt, and will be no more if it continually goes through life. Socrates responds to Simmias with a few objections, namely that if the soul is harmonious, then it must be incapable of evil, and equally good to all other souls, which seems untrue. Secondly, the soul controls aspects of us, and must therefore be occasionally opposed to aspects of us in order to correct them, and if this is true, then it is not entirely harmonious. These arguments ultimately convince Simmias. Socrates has one final argument for the immortality of the soul, quoting from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. 1. Nothing can become its opposite while still being itself. It either flees away or is destroyed at the approach of the opposites. For example, tallness cannot become shortness while still being tall. 2. This is true not only of opposites, but in the similar way of things that contain opposites. For example, fire and snow are not themselves opposites, but fire always brings hot with it, and snow always brings cold with it. So fire will not become cold without ceasing to be fire, nor will snow become hot without ceasing to be snow. 3. The soul always brings life with it. 4. Therefore, soul will never admit the opposite of life, that is, death, without ceasing to be soul. 5. But what does not admit death is also indestructible. 6. Therefore, the soul is indestructible. Finally, Socrates presents us with a myth that tells us that we will be punished in the afterlife if we are wicked. This must be said after arguing for so long that the soul is immortal, because of course this means we must be concerned about our soul in this life and the next. With that, Socrates tells his friends that he is not concerned about how they bury him, because his body is not his after his death, and asks them to bring the hemlock immediately, which he drinks, and the giant of philosophy breathes his last breaths. Now, most scholars agree that this is a treatise on the immortality of the soul and the importance of the world of the forms, but I would like to leave you with one opposing opinion, just to give you some diversity of thought. Here I'm quoting from John P. Anton's The Ultimate Theme of Phaedo. In the Phaedo, Socrates' superiority becomes altogether positive. Here he shows and proves that he has and what he is. The prophecy of the Delphic oracle is about to be fulfilled. Socrates, at the very hour of his death, nay, the very moment that he dies, radiates knowledge and virtue, and he attains assurance and climbs to the exalted heights of excellence the very moment he dies. The attainment of the positive wisdom is scaled with the cessation of life. Herein lies the existential paradox that emerges with the juxtaposition of two phases of Socrates, i.e., the man in the apology and the man in death. The former has a negative knowledge, but is living. The latter has positive wisdom, but is dying. What does this prove? If anything, it proves that Plato knew what he wanted to accomplish through the Phaedo, the attainability of arete, which seems to me to be the ultimate theme of Phaedo.